On November 18, 1942, high above the Guadalcanal's Henderson Field, an unnamed Japanese Zero pilot felt his hands instinctively tighten around the control stick, his gaze fixed on the peculiar twin-boomed American fighters ascending from the airstrip below. This very day would etch itself into history, as the pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron initiated the first assault by Lightnings against Japanese fighters, a pivotal moment destined to dismantle Japan's long-held belief in its aerial supremacy. Twin engines, twin tails, climbing like nothing we have ever witnessed, he would later recount to his squadron commander in Rabaul, his words betraying the first hairline fractures in 3 years of unyielding Japanese air dominance. Through the curved plexiglass of his canopy, he had just seen the impossible, a sight that defied every principle ingrained in Japanese naval aviation doctrine. Those American P-38 Lightning fighters, the very same twin-boomed aircraft dismissed by Japanese intelligence as ponderous and awkward, had surged from sea level to combat altitude with a speed his own Mitsubishi A6M20 could not hope to match. Across the skies of China, in the Philippines, and over the waters of Pearl Harbor, the Zero had been the undisputed king. No Allied fighter had ever presented a true challenge to its phenomenal climb rate or its exquisite maneuverability. Yet here, suspended above this blood-drenched island, American pilots in their twin-engined behemoths were now dictating the very rules of engagement from altitudes the Zero struggled desperately to attain. In that initial decisive clash, the P-38s of the 339th Fighter Squadron claimed 3 Japanese aircraft, executing their attacks from lofty heights that rendered the Zero's legendary turning prowess utterly useless. The very calculus of air superiority was being fundamentally rewritten, not within the pages of dogfighting manuals, but in the unforgiving reality of superior high-altitude performance, a reality that would soon obliterate every assumption Japanese pilots held about their own invincibility, their machines, and their foe. The sun of their confidence had begun its descent. The eventual collapse of Japanese air superiority had started its insidious creep long before that fateful November day, though such a notion would have been met with disbelief by anyone in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Since the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese naval aviators had carved a path across the Pacific, shrouded in an aura of absolute invincibility. The Mitsubishi A6M0, with its astonishing range, its incredibly tight turning radius, and its impeccably trained pilots, had rightfully earned a fearsome and chilling reputation. The Zero's top speed of 332 km at its critical altitude was indeed impressive, and its uncanny ability to turn inside any Allied fighter made it a lethal predator in conventional close-quarters dogfights. Among these elite aviators was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, a man with multiple victories to his name, a seasoned veteran of the China campaign, and a survivor of countless aerial engagements. By 1942, Sakai had already amassed 13 victories in the Borneo campaign alone, before his transfer to Lae, New Guinea, where he would go on to achieve the majority of his staggering 64 claimed kills. His confidence, much like that of his comrades, was unwavering and absolute. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, Sakai's direct superior, had addressed his pilots just before they commenced combat operations. The American fighters over the Guadalcanal area are understood to have originated from aircraft carriers supporting the invasion. They are likely standard American Navy fighters, not Army aircraft. The Japanese pilots were fully expecting to face carrier-based F-4F Wildcats, an aircraft they had successfully bested on previous occasions. Indeed, the early months of 1942 seemed to do nothing but confirm Japan's perceived superiority. Japanese pilots had effortlessly shot down obsolete Brewster Buffaloes over Singapore. They had decimated Curtiss P-40 Warhawks above Java, and they had swept aside British Hurricanes over Burma. The Zero enjoyed an almost complete and utter initial dominance throughout the Pacific theater. Even when confronted with newer Allied fighters, Japanese pilots consistently maintained their psychological advantage, an edge forged through superior training and tactics honed over years of relentless combat in China. But then, intelligence reports began to filter back to Japanese squadrons in mid-1942, speaking of a new American fighter, something entirely different. Twin engines, twin tails, and a heavy concentration of armament in the nose. These reports were largely dismissed by most squadron commanders. How could a twin-engine fighter possibly pose a threat to the agile, nimble Zero? Japanese naval doctrine, a philosophy built upon the bedrock of the decisive battle and the supremacy of individual combat skill, possessed no framework, no context for understanding what was about to unfold. The Lightning emerges. The P-38 Lightning stood alone as the only genuinely successful twin-engine daytime fighter of the entire war. It was the remarkable result of Lockheed's response to a February 1937 U.S. Army Air Corps specification, calling for a long-range interceptor. The designer, Clarence Kelly Johnson, and his brilliant team had conceived something utterly unprecedented. They had created a fighter capable of exceeding 400 knots per hour, climbing to the rarefied air of 40,000 feet, and carrying enough fuel for missions that stretched beyond 1,000 miles. The P-38's twin Allison V1710 engines, each one generating a formidable 150 horsepower with the aid of turbo-supercharging, endowed it with performance characteristics that seemed utterly impossible to Japanese engineers. While the Zero had been meticulously designed for maximum maneuverability with minimum weight, even foregoing armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks in its early models, the Lightning represented an entirely different philosophy of aerial combat. It was a philosophy built on four pillars: speed, altitude, firepower, and survivability. The first P-38s did not arrive in the Pacific Theater with a triumphant fanfare, but rather with a host of mechanical problems. When the initial batch of P-38s reached Australia, they were found to have several design flaws, and consequently, their combat debut was delayed. But by the latter part of 1942, these issues were being systematically resolved, and seasoned pilots from P-40 squadrons were beginning to transition to the new, formidable fighter. The 49th Fighter Group was still equipped with P-40s at the time, but they too would soon make the switch to the Lightning. These pilots brought with them a wealth of hard-won experience gained from their encounters with Japanese fighters. They had learned, often through a brutal process of fatal trial and error, never to engage a Zero in a turning fight. The P-38 would finally give them the tool they needed to fight on their own terms. First blood over the Solomons. November 18, 1942, marked the Lightning's first major engagement with Japanese fighters, a day when pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, intercepted Japanese aircraft while escorting Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. The results of this encounter left both sides utterly stunned. Japanese pilots, flying escort for their own bombers, were the first to spot the strange, twin-boomed silhouettes climbing purposefully from the south. Their initial reaction was one of pure confusion. Were these bombers or perhaps reconnaissance aircraft? The astonishing rate of climb they were witnessing suggested neither. By the time they finally recognized them as fighters, the P-38s had already secured a commanding 5,000-foot altitude advantage. The P-38s would consistently patrol far above the altitude at which the Zero could operate effectively. Their incredible speed at these high altitudes allowed them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions with ease. Then the big fighters would plunge from the heavens, smashing into the hapless Zero fighters below. The mathematics of this new reality were stark and unforgiving. While the Zero's low-speed maneuverability was the stuff of legend, its high-speed maneuverability was actually inferior to that of the P-38 at altitude. Above 250 mph, the Zero's controls became increasingly heavy and unresponsive. Above 300 mph, the aircraft became incredibly difficult to maneuver at all. The P-38, on the other hand, with its hydraulically boosted controls in later models, maintained its effectiveness even in high-speed dives that approached a breathtaking 500 mph. The technological chasm. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots went far beyond mere performance numbers. The P-38 represented a fundamentally different approach to aerial warfare, an approach that Japanese military culture had completely failed to anticipate. The Lightning's armament, a devastating concentration of 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon all housed in the nose, delivered a focused stream of overwhelming firepower that didn't require the complex gun convergence calculations necessary for wing-mounted weapons. The turbo-supercharged engines were equally revolutionary to the Japanese understanding of aircraft technology. The P-38's turbo-superchargers made it one of the very earliest Allied fighters capable of performing well at high altitudes, while also muffling the exhaust, making the P-38's operation relatively quiet. Japanese pilots often didn't hear the P-38's approaching until it was far too late. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, producing 950 horsepower at sea level, lost power dramatically as it gained altitude. By 20,000 feet, it was producing barely 750 horsepower. In stark contrast, the P-38's turbo-supercharged Allisons maintained their power output to much higher altitudes, giving them an overwhelming advantage in the vertical dimension of aerial combat. The psychology of technological inferiority. By early 1943, the profound psychological impact on Japanese pilots was becoming increasingly evident in squadron reports and personal letters. The carefully cultivated mythology of the Zero's invincibility, a myth that had been nurtured since the aircraft's debut in China, was now crumbling. Japanese pilots spoke of a constant gnawing tension, knowing that a P-38 could strike from anywhere, at any time. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima encountered what was to become a famous double-team maneuver on the part of the enemy. Two Wildcats jumped on the commander's plane. He had no trouble in getting on the tail of an enemy fighter, but he never had a chance to fire before the Grumman's teammate roared at him from the side. Nakajima was raging when he got back to Rabaul. He had been forced to dive and run for safety. This experience against Wildcats was nothing compared to what the P-38 would bring. Saburo Sakai himself would later admit, it was no longer possible for the Zero fighters to successfully engage the P-38s, except under the most unusual conditions, which unhappily seldom presented themselves. This admission, coming from Japan's most famous ace, carried a devastating weight among the pilot community. The tactical reality was even worse than the individual combat statistics suggested. The P-38's impressive range meant that it could appear anywhere across the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater. With a range of 1,600 miles, thanks to drop tanks, the Lightning could escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory or conduct fighter sweeps far from American bases. Japanese pilots could no longer count on numerical superiority, even over their own territory. The Yamamoto mission, ultimate demonstration. Nothing demonstrated the P-38's superiority more dramatically than Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943, when 16 P-38s flew a 435-mile interception mission to shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The mission demanded precise navigation over open water, extreme range, and the ability to successfully engage both bombers and their fighter escorts. Major John Mitchell led the mission, with the aircraft flying at a mere 50 feet above the ocean to avoid radar detection, before climbing rapidly to their intercept altitude. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was absolutely devastating. Their most revered leader, traveling with 6 Zero escorts, had been hunted down and killed by American fighters operating at the extreme edge of their range. Zero pilot Kenji Yanagi, who had been part of Yamamoto's fighter escort, witnessed the attack firsthand. His testimony revealed the utter shock of the Japanese pilots at the P-38's capabilities. The Lightning pilots had appeared as if from nowhere, executed their attack with surgical precision, and escaped before the Zero escorts could mount an effective response. The American pilots had calculated the interception down to the minute, arriving at the precise moment when Yamamoto's flight was at its most vulnerable, descending for a landing. This level of operational planning, combined with the P-38's incredible performance, represented capabilities that Japan simply could not match: tactical evolution and adaptation. As 1943 progressed, American pilots meticulously refined their tactics to maximize the P-38's inherent advantages. The boom and zoom attack, diving from altitude, firing a devastating burst, and then climbing away before the enemy could react, became their standard procedure. Japanese pilots found themselves utterly helpless against these tactics. The very first air-to-air encounter between the Japanese and the P-38 resulted in 15 Japanese aircraft shot down. For the loss of only one P-38, these lopsided victories became increasingly common as American pilots gained more and more experience with their new mount. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures in a desperate bid to turn the tide. They tried using dive brakes to force overshooting attacks. They attempted to lure P-38s into low-altitude turning fights. They even developed new loose formations to better spot incoming attacks. But nothing worked consistently. The performance gap was simply too vast to overcome. Industrial reality behind the performance. The P-38's superiority reflected a deeper, more profound truth about American industrial capability. A truth that Japanese pilots were only just beginning to grasp. By the war's end, over 10,000 P-38s would be manufactured, with 18 distinct models representing a continuous cycle of improvement. Each new variant addressed weaknesses and enhanced strengths, all based on invaluable combat experience. The P-38J model, arriving in late 1943, incorporated hydraulically boosted ailerons to improve its roll rate. It addressed the cockpit heating issues that had plagued earlier models in Europe, and it featured improved turbo-superchargers for even better altitude performance. Japanese aircraft development, meanwhile, struggled to produce even incremental improvements to the aging Zero design. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, privately admitted to his colleagues in mid-1943, "We are not just facing a superior fighter. We are facing a system of continuous improvement that we cannot possibly match. Each new American fighter we encounter is better than the last." The pilot experienced divergence. The technological gap was amplified by a diverging quality in pilots. By mid-1943, Japan was losing its experienced pilots far faster than they could be replaced. The grim realities of Japan's inability to adequately replace its war losses, both in materials and in skilled personnel, were becoming starkly apparent. Training programs were drastically shortened, from 2 years to less than 6 months. New pilots were arriving at combat units with less than 200 hours of flight time. American pilots, conversely, were arriving with 400 to 600 hours of training under their belts. They had practiced combat tactics in advanced training units. They had studied gun camera footage from actual combats, and they had trained on multiple aircraft types. When they transitioned to P-38s, they received specialized training in twin-engine operations and high-altitude combat tactics, mechanical complexity, and reliability. The P-38's twin-engine configuration provided another advantage that Japanese pilots hadn't fully appreciated: survivability. With 2 engines, even severely damaged Lightnings could often limp home on a single propeller. The psychological impact of this reliability was profound. Japanese pilots, flying single-engine aircraft over vast stretches of ocean, faced almost certain death if their engine failed. The Zero's extreme range came at the cost of minimal armor and a lack of self-sealing fuel tanks. A single bullet in the wrong place meant a fiery death or a long swim in shark-infested waters. The intelligence war. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence was warning its pilots to avoid duels with the Lightning, noting its terrifying diving speed, its accuracy, and its uncanny ability to appear unexpectedly. These intelligence reports, circulated among Japanese squadrons, revealed a growing and painful understanding of their disadvantage. One captured Japanese document from December 1943 stated, "The P-38 type fighter must be considered the most dangerous American aircraft in the Pacific. Its speed and climb rate exceed anything we can achieve. Engagement should be avoided unless possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and an advantageous position." This admission, that Japanese pilots should actively avoid combat with American fighters, represented a complete and utter reversal of the warrior ethic that had for so long defined Japanese naval aviation. The psychological impact was devastating. Pilots who had been trained to seek out combat at every opportunity were now being told to run from the enemy. The aces tell the tale. The emergence of American P-38 aces provided stark, undeniable evidence of the fighter's superiority. Major Richard Dick Bong became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all of them scored in P-38s. Major Thomas "Tommy" Maguire achieved 38 victories before being killed in January 1945. These incredible scores, achieved in less than 2 years of combat, far exceeded what most Japanese aces had accomplished in 3 or 4 years of war. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft would ultimately fall to P-38s in the Pacific Theater. This tally represented not just aircraft destroyed, but also experienced pilots lost, pilots that Japan could never hope to replace. Each victory diminished Japanese air power exponentially, as their training programs struggled to produce even basically competent replacements. Technical innovation continues. As 1944 progressed, the P-38 continued to evolve, while Japanese aircraft development stagnated. The P-38L model featured uprated engines that produced even more power at altitude, improved cooling systems, and rocket launchers for ground attack missions. These aircraft could carry substantial bomb loads in addition to their standard armament. Japanese pilots, watching P-38s transition from air superiority missions to devastating ground attacks, realized they were facing not just a superior fighter, but a weapons system of unprecedented versatility. The cultural shock. Beyond the technological superiority, Japanese pilots struggled to comprehend the American approach to air combat. The Japanese had elevated aerial combat to an art form, emphasizing individual skill and the warrior spirit. The Americans, in contrast, treated it as an engineering problem to be solved with superior technology and tactics. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer who analyzed combat reports, wrote, "After the war, we could not accept that fighting spirit alone was insufficient. Every report of P-38 superiority was met with demands for greater dedication, for a more aggressive spirit. We confused courage with capability. This cultural blindness prevented any effective adaptation. While American pilots continuously refined their tactics based on combat experience, Japanese training continued to emphasize aerobatic skill and individual combat prowess, skills that were utterly useless against an enemy that refused to engage on those terms." The radar revolution. By mid-1944, some P-38s were being equipped with primitive airborne radar for night fighting operations. This technology was completely beyond Japan's capability to either match or counter. The night had previously been a sanctuary for Japanese operations. Now even the darkness offered no protection. The Marianas Turkey Shoot. While the P-38 didn't participate directly in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, its impact was keenly felt in the quality of the Japanese pilots who faced the U.S. Navy's Hellcats. Years of attrition against P-38s and other American fighters had systematically eliminated Japan's experienced pilots. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft for minimal losses, was the culmination of a process that the P-38 had greatly accelerated. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier forces, later admitted, "Our pilots were not ready. They had neither the experience nor the aircraft to match the Americans." The war in the air had been lost long before that day. Desperation and innovation. As 1944 turned to 1945, Japanese attempts to counter the P-38 became increasingly desperate. They experimented with ramming attacks, recognizing that conventional combat was now hopeless. They developed phosphorus anti-aircraft shells specifically to target the P-38's fuel tanks. They even attempted to develop their own twin-engine fighters, though none ever reached operational status in meaningful numbers. The Kawasaki Ki-102, Japan's attempt at a twin-engine fighter comparable to the P-38, only served to demonstrate the vast technological gap. While the P-38 had been operational since 1941, the Ki-102 didn't enter service until 1945, and only 238 were ever built. It was slower than the P-38, it climbed poorly, and it suffered from chronic engine problems. The end of air superiority. By early 1945, Japanese pilots no longer spoke of air superiority or even air parity. They spoke only of survival. The P-38, along with other American fighters, had established complete and total dominance over Japanese airspace. Saburo Sakai himself would later state that the P-38 destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. The numbers tell the story. The statistics of P-38 operations in the Pacific tell a story of overwhelming superiority. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft were destroyed by P-38s. Major Richard Bong claimed 40 victories, all in P-38s. Major Thomas Maguire achieved 38 victories in P-38s. P-38 pilots claimed more Japanese aircraft than any other Army Air Force fighter. Against these achievements, the Japanese loss rates told a much grimmer story. By the war's end, Japan had lost over 90% of the experienced pilots who had begun the war. The average Japanese pilot in 1945 had less than 100 hours of flight time. They were not warriors. They were sacrificial lambs, sent against an enemy they had no hope of defeating. Post-war revelations. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces conducted extensive interviews with surviving Japanese pilots and commanders. These interviews revealed the full extent of the psychological impact the P-38 had inflicted. Commander Masatake Okumiya admitted, "The P-38 broke our confidence completely. We had believed in our superiority, in our aircraft, in our training. The Lightning showed us we were wrong about everything. It wasn't just faster or better armed. It represented a way of war we couldn't match." One Japanese pilot, when interviewed, stated, "On my first confrontation with the P-38, I was astonished to find an American aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive our Zero, which we thought was the most superior fighter plane in the world." The technical analysis. Post-war technical analysis revealed the full extent of the performance gap. For the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero, maximum speed of 332 km/h at critical altitude, a service ceiling of 33,000 feet, though it struggled above 25,000. Its climb rate was 3,100 feet per minute, decreasing rapidly with altitude. It had a range of 1,130 miles, which was exceptional for its time. Its armament consisted of two 7.7 mm machine guns and two 20 mm cannon, with limited ammunition. There was no armor in the early models, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. For the Lockheed P-38L Lightning, a maximum speed of over 400 km/h, a service ceiling of 44,000 feet, and a climb rate of 4,650 feet per minute at sea level. Its range was 1,600 miles with drop tanks. Its armament included four 50 caliber machine guns and one 20 mm cannon. It had extensive pilot protection in the form of armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks were standard. The numbers revealed a complete and utter mismatch. The Zero had been designed for a different kind of war, a war where individual combat skill and maneuverability determined victory. The P-38 represented industrial-age warfare, where technology, production capacity, and systematic improvement determined the outcomes. The industrial context. The P-38's superiority reflected an American industrial might that utterly dwarfed Japan's capacity. Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38s during the war. Japan, in contrast, produced approximately 10,000 Zeros in total, but spread over a longer period and with declining quality as the war progressed. American production methods, utilizing assembly line techniques perfected in the automobile manufacturing industry, could produce P-38s faster than Japan could ever hope to train pilots. Each P-38 incorporated thousands of specialized components, all manufactured to precise tolerances, a testament to an American industrial coordination that Japan simply couldn't replicate. The Allison engines powering the P-38 were masterpieces of engineering, incorporating supercharging technology, precision manufacturing, and metallurgy that were far beyond Japanese capabilities. While Japanese engines required extensive hand fitting and adjustment, American engines were essentially interchangeable, simplifying maintenance and vastly improving reliability. The training disparity. By 1944, the gap in pilot training had become a chasm. American P-38 pilots received specialized twin-engine training, including over 100 hours on twin-engine trainers before they even touched a P-38. They mastered engine-out procedures and asymmetric thrust management. They were trained in high-altitude physiology and oxygen system management. Their gunnery training used camera guns and towed targets. They learned formation tactics and mutual support procedures. They received escape and evasion training and possessed a comprehensive knowledge of their aircraft systems. Japanese training by 1944 consisted of basic flight instruction, only 50 to 100 hours. They received minimal combat tactics training and limited gunnery practice, as ammunition was scarce. There was no specialized high-altitude training. The emphasis was on spirit over tactical doctrine, and increasingly on preparation for special attack, or kamikaze, missions. The result was predictable. American pilots arrived in the theater as skilled professionals. Japanese pilots arrived as barely competent sacrifices. Tactical evolution. The P-38 forced fundamental changes in aerial combat tactics. The traditional turning dogfight, which had dominated aerial combat since World War I, became obsolete. While the P-38 could not outturn the A6M0 when flying below 200 mph, its superior speed, coupled with its good rate of climb, meant that it could use energy tactics with devastating effectiveness. American pilots developed the high-side pass, approaching from above and behind, diving through the enemy formation with guns blazing, and then zooming back to altitude before the enemy could possibly react. This tactic, impossible without the P-38's performance advantages, rendered Japanese defensive formations completely useless. The Japanese attempted to adapt by stationing fighters at multiple altitudes, but this only dispersed their forces and made coordination impossible. They tried using clouds for concealment, but the P-38's speed allowed it to cover vast areas quickly, finding Japanese aircraft wherever they tried to hide. The psychological warfare component. The distinctive appearance of the P-38 became a psychological weapon in itself. Its twin-boom design looked alien to Japanese pilots, who initially dismissed it as heavy and clumsy. This unique silhouette, however, soon became a symbol of American technological superiority that struck fear into the hearts of Japanese pilots long before combat was even joined. Ground crews reported that the mere rumor of P-38s in the area would cause Japanese pilots to delay their missions or request additional escorts. The aircraft's nickname among Japanese pilots, "Two planes, one pilot," reflected both their confusion about its design and their deep-seated respect for its capabilities. Strategic impact. The P-38's superiority had strategic implications that went far beyond tactical air combat. Japanese military planning had assumed that rough air parity would allow their superior warrior spirit to prevail. The P-38 demonstrated that technology could create such an overwhelming advantage that spirit became utterly irrelevant. This stark realization influenced Japanese strategic decisions, including the acceleration of kamikaze tactics as conventional air combat became hopeless. It led to the withdrawal of their remaining experienced pilots to the defense of the home islands. It resulted in the abandonment of offensive air operations by mid-1944. It caused a diversion of precious resources to desperate wonder weapon projects, and it fostered a recognition that the war was unwinnable by conventional means. Admiral Soemu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, privately acknowledged in October 1944, "We no longer have an air force capable of conventional operations. The American fighters, especially the P-38, have eliminated our ability to contest the skies." The maintenance and logistics victory. The P-38's twin-engine complexity initially concerned American planners, but it ultimately demonstrated another American advantage: sophisticated maintenance and logistics capabilities. P-38 squadrons maintained operational rates exceeding 80%, even in the primitive conditions of the Pacific. Japanese units, flying simpler single-engine fighters, struggled to maintain 50% availability by 1944. American maintenance crews, many of them recruited from civilian aviation and automotive industries, brought systematic approaches to aircraft maintenance. They developed specialized tools, standardized procedures, and preventive maintenance schedules. Japanese maintenance, in contrast, remained largely traditional, relying on individual skill rather than systematic procedures. The navigation technology gap. P-38s, equipped with radio direction-finding equipment, could navigate with remarkable accuracy over the vast Pacific distances. They could home in on radio beacons, find their bases in poor weather, and conduct precise time-on-target attacks. Japanese pilots still relied primarily on dead reckoning and visual navigation, severely limiting their operational flexibility. This navigation advantage became absolutely critical during long-range missions. The Yamamoto interception mission required precise navigation over 435 miles of open ocean, arriving at the exact point at the exact time. Japanese pilots simply could not have executed such a mission with their available technology. The impact on Japanese naval aviation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire strategic doctrine around naval aviation. The P-38's dominance shattered this very foundation. Carrier air groups, painstakingly rebuilt after the losses at Midway, were decimated by P-38s and other American fighters during the island campaigns. By 1944, Japanese carriers were sailing with half-strength air groups composed of poorly trained pilots. Vice Admiral Saburo Ozawa, commanding the first mobile fleet, reported before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, "Our pilots are not ready for combat against American fighters. They can barely land on carriers, much less fight P-38s and Hellcats. We are sending them to certain death." The cultural transformation. The encounter with the P-38 forced a fundamental transformation in Japanese military thinking. The Bushido Code, emphasizing spiritual strength and individual warrior prowess, proved wholly inadequate against American industrial warfare. Younger Japanese officers began to question the entire basis of Japanese military doctrine. This cultural transformation extended beyond the military. Japanese pilots returning from combat, those few who survived, brought with them stories of American technological superiority that directly contradicted years of propaganda about Western decadence and Japanese spiritual superiority. The economic reality. The P-38 program represented an economic investment that Japan could not possibly match. Each P-38 cost approximately $97,000 in 1944. It was expensive, but America produced them by the thousands. Japan struggled to produce aircraft costing a fraction of that amount in any meaningful numbers. The aluminum required for a single P-38 exceeded what many Japanese aircraft factories received in a month by 1944. The precision instruments, the turbo-superchargers, the constant-speed propellers, each component represented industrial capabilities that Japan had never developed. The pilot testimony. The most powerful evidence of the P-38's impact comes from the testimonies of Japanese pilots themselves. These men, trained to never admit weakness, universally acknowledged the lightning's superiority in post-war interviews. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai stated, "The P-38 would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could fly. Their great speed at high altitudes allowed them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Then, the big fighters would plunge from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters. The ultimate humiliation. Perhaps the greatest humiliation came not from combat losses, but from the P-38's other capabilities. P-38 reconnaissance variants obtained 90% of the aerial photography in the Pacific Theater. Japanese positions, movements, and preparations were constantly under observation. The same aircraft that dominated them in combat was also mapping their defeat in meticulous detail. Japanese commanders realized that their every move was being watched, photographed, and analyzed. The P-38 F-5 photo reconnaissance variant, stripped of its weapons but retaining its full performance, could photograph Japanese installations with complete impunity. Japanese fighters sent to intercept them simply couldn't reach their altitude. The legacy of shock. The shock that Japanese pilots experienced when encountering the P-38 extended far beyond the war. It influenced post-war Japanese aviation development, military doctrine, and even cultural attitudes toward technology versus tradition. Many surviving Japanese pilots became advocates for technological advancement in post-war Japan. They had learned firsthand that courage without capability was meaningless. Their experiences profoundly influenced Japan's post-war embrace of technology and industrial development. Saburo Sakai, who became a successful businessman after the war, often spoke about the lessons learned from facing the P-38. "The lightning taught us that we must never again fall behind technologically. It showed us that industrial power, not warrior spirit, determines victory in modern war. The technical innovation race. The P-38's evolution during the war demonstrated American advantages in rapid technical innovation. Problems identified in combat were quickly addressed in new production models. Compressibility issues led to the development of dive flaps. Cold cockpits led to improved heating systems. Complaints about the roll rate led to the introduction of hydraulically boosted ailerons. Japanese aircraft development, constrained by limited resources and institutional rigidity, couldn't possibly match this pace of improvement. The Zero that fought in 1945 was essentially the same aircraft that had attacked Pearl Harbor with only minor improvements. The P-38L of 1945 was dramatically superior to the P-38E of 1942. The final assessment. General George C. Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, was quoted as saying, "The P-38 pilots, flying at great height, chose when and where they wanted to fight, with disastrous results for the Japanese pilots." This ability to dictate the terms of engagement represented a revolution in air combat that Japanese military doctrine never successfully countered. The statistics are overwhelming. By the war's end, the two top American aces had shot down 78 Japanese aircraft between them, all in P-38s. The top surviving Japanese ace had 64 victories, accumulated over 6 years of war. The mathematics of attrition were simply unsustainable for Japan. The broader implications. The P-38's dominance over the Zero represented more than just technological superiority. It demonstrated fundamental differences in the approach to warfare, in industrial capacity, innovation, culture, and strategic thinking. The Japanese had prepared for a short, decisive war, where their warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The P-38 represented America's preparation for a long industrial war, where technology and production would prove decisive. The psychological shock experienced by Japanese pilots upon encountering the P-38 was, in reality, the shock of encountering modernity itself. The Lightning represented the systematic application of science, engineering, and industrial management to warfare. Against this, the samurai tradition, however noble, was helpless. The human cost. Behind the statistics and the technical specifications lay a human tragedy. Thousands of young Japanese pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time, were sent against P-38s in obsolescent aircraft. They knew they had no chance. Their letters home, discovered after the war, reveal young men resigned to their deaths. One young pilot wrote before his final mission, "Mother, I will face the twin-tailed devils tomorrow. I do not expect to return. They fly higher and faster than we can imagine. I will do my duty, but I know it is hopeless." He was shot down by P-38s over Rabaul in March 1944. His was one of thousands of similar stories, young lives sacrificed to a technological gap that no amount of courage could ever bridge. The lasting influence. The P-38's impact extended far beyond World War II. It influenced Cold War aircraft development, with both the United States and the Soviet Union developing twin-engine, high-altitude interceptors based on the lessons learned from the Lightning. The concept of using technology to create an overwhelming advantage became central to American military doctrine. For Japan, the experience influenced their post-war self-defense forces to prioritize quality over quantity and advanced technology over mass mobilization. The trauma of technological inferiority left lasting marks on Japanese military thinking. Conclusion: the end of an era. The shock that Japanese pilots experienced when they found they could not outrun or outclimb the P-38 Lightning marked the end of an era in aerial warfare, the age of the individual warrior pilot, where personal skill and courage determined victory, died in the skies over the Pacific. It was replaced by industrial-age warfare, where technology, production capacity, and systematic innovation determined the outcomes. Saburo Sakai's post-war reflection that the P-38 destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot captured the very essence of this transformation. It wasn't just that the P-38 was faster or climbed better. It represented a way of war that Japan simply couldn't match. The Japanese pilots who survived learned a harsh lesson. In modern war, Courage without technology is not heroism, but futility. The P-38 Lightning didn't just shoot down Japanese aircraft, it shattered an entire worldview about warfare, honor, and national power. Their shock was the shock of discovering that everything they had believed about air combat was wrong. The Zero, which had seemed invincible in 1941, was obsolete by 1943. The pilots who had trained for years in aerobatic combat found their skills utterly useless against an enemy that refused to engage on those terms. In the end, the twin-tailed devil that haunted the nightmares of Japanese pilots represented more than just a superior fighter aircraft. It embodied American industrial might, technological innovation, and a systematic approach to warfare that would define the second half of the 20th century. The last word belongs to Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous fighter ace, who survived the war and lived to reflect on its lessons. The P-38 taught us the hardest lesson of all, that the age of the samurai was over. In the skies over the Pacific, we met the future, and it destroyed us. The shock of that encounter reverberates still, a reminder that in the crucible of war, technology and industrial capacity ultimately triumph over tradition and individual valor. The Japanese pilots who could not outrun or outclimb the P-38 Lightning learned this lesson at the cost of their lives, their aircraft, and ultimately, their empire's dreams of dominance. They had challenged the arsenal of democracy with the spirit of the samurai. The P-38 Lightning was democracy's answer, delivered at 400 miles per hour from 30,000 feet, with a devastating precision that no amount of courage could ever overcome.